Hello, and welcome to our discussion on Fivetran and ELT use cases. Today, we're going to be discussing essentially what is an ELT, kind of the pros and cons of an ELT, as well as how ELTs are impacting companies' bottom line. So we're going to talk about some actual use cases where companies have been able to implement ELTs and either increase revenue or decrease costs through a combination of reducing engineering time and finding better insights in their data. But the first question is, what is an ELT? Now for today, we're going to mostly be looking at Fivetran. Fivetran is a highly comprehensive ELT tool that is becoming more popular every day. It offers a variety of connectors that can help you easily pull from your various data sources, as well as some other features that make it very useful. But what is an ELT? So it stands for Extract, Load, Transform, which is slightly different than the typical data engineering version of an ETL, which just basically moves the T and the L. In turn, only refers to when the transform and the load occur in the whole process. In this case, Fivetran will essentially extract your data from multiple data sources like Zendesk, Amazon Kinesis, Salesforce, Workday, and 100 other plus connectors, and it will move it into some form of data warehouse, and that will be essentially your load phase. In this case, we're using the example Snowflake because in many of the use cases that were provided in Fivetran's anthology, Snowflake was also used. And then you'll perform some sort of transform using SQL or Python or some other analytical tool to essentially, do some sort of metric development or calculate some report. So that's what an ELT is. The focus being in this case, just getting the data into the data warehouse or data lake as fast as possible to reduce the current bottleneck, which is typically the data engineers just trying to get the data from some sort of data source into your data warehouse. This is often really connected to the fact that you need to write some sort of custom code to connect to each of these various data sources. That takes a lot of time. So what a lot of ELT tools do that make it very simple is just eliminate the need to write any of that initial code in the first place. Again, Fivetran has a whole host of other useful features, but I wanted to focus more on the use cases where companies have actually used tools like Fivetran to really take advantage of this methodology. So we're going over use cases. Let's discuss some pros and cons of ELTs. It's really very hard to discuss the pros and cons of ELTs without somewhat referencing ETLs at the same time, since they both are kind of used for the same thing, and there are really supporters on both sides of these concepts. So pros of ELTs are they are very quick to develop with limited engineers. Because the focus is less on the transforms and the complex business logic and more on just getting data into the data warehouse, it's very easy to get data from point A to point B. This is why, again, things like Fivetran are very easy. You can just point it towards some sort of data source and essentially set up on how often you want to load that data, as well as set up things like change data capture. This reduces a lot of the mundane work that most data engineers do, which is creating, various data connectors and API connections between, again, 30 or 40 different data sources. This is at least one reason that I tend to like the EL format, just because, again, it reduces that heavy work that really doesn't provide much value anyways. Another factor there is reduced maintenance. Typically, you're going to be writing a lot of your ETLs in code or some sort of SSIS tool or other drag and drop type ETL tool or workflow management tool. All of this generally does require some sort of maintenance. One of the reasons being is that a lot of these tools aren't very flexible. So if you've ever worked with SSIS or something similar, if one field changes, if a value changes, if a new field is added, sometimes this can actually either break or at least cause issues with your pipeline. So generally, a lot of ELTs tend to be a little more dynamic depending on how you develop it, just because they often have less constraints. Now, despite all this, they are far from perfect, obviously. One issue being, there's only so many connectors, right? If you've got custom software that isn't one of the majorly used pieces of third-party software like Salesforce or Workday, there might not be a connector for it. Truthfully, the same thing is true for ETLs. So it is a con, but it's a con on both sides. Whether it's an ETL or an ELT, you're going to be having create custom connectors in those cases. Another problem with ELTs, I think, is it opens the door to a lack of data governance. Technically, ETLs have the same problem, but I think because of the fact that the transform is done first. There's often a lot more discussion on the business logic and what data should actually come into the data warehouse, where with an ELT, because it is so easy, there is this tendency just to pull in the data and figure this out later. So that poses some risk if you don't have some sort of process in place to make sure that the data you're using is actually your source of truth data and not possibly, some data that you've integrated from another third-party tool, and you're pulling in 3 or 4 times, and now you've got 3 or 4 versions of the same field across those different data sources. You can just as easily set up some sort of process to make sure that this data doesn't get into your final layer of your core data, but it is a risk, and I would say it's a con just because it's easier to do. You will still need to run transforms. This doesn't get rid of the T stage. I think a lot of times the view is that the analysts will be the only ones running transforms, but I think, sometimes data engineers still need to do some sort of modeling or cleanup work on the raw data. Again, it depends on the data set. Some data sets are clean-ish coming in. Others are, need a lot of work, a lot of removing a duplicate entries, etc. So you're not getting rid of that work in some cases. You do get that raw data in quickly, but it doesn't mean you don't have to clean it up still. And finally, ELTs are relatively new, meaning that they're still maturing and there's still new products coming out. That being said, ELTs definitely are a great, I think, solution, especially for smaller companies who need to get data quickly and don't have the ability to hire, a full-time data engineer or data scientist. So those are some quick pros and cons. And now let's go over into the use cases and discuss how companies are using ELTs to reduce their engineering time and increase their profits. All right, so for the first case, let's talk about Discover.org. Discover.org does lead gen, and they were trying to essentially provide better information both to internally and externally, but they didn't have access to all of their data. And this was the major problem. They were essentially limited to using whatever AWS replica databases that they created, but they were missing information from sources like Marketo, Salesforce, and a few other key data sources that they would have to create custom connectors as well as have more engineers on staff just to maintain all of those different data pipelines. Instead, using Fivetran, they were able to connect to various data sources, again, like Marketo, Google Sheets, Sauna, and the rest that you see here, without having to hire extra engineers. This led to an 80 or 90% increase in the annual contract value, so massive increase, as well as eliminating the need to hire 2 to 3 engineers, which was probably a reduction of about 3 to 500K salary-wise, if not, more or less, depending on if you were to add in all the benefits. Finally, they were able to provide more value to their customers by creating embedded dashboards using Looker, using all this data. So it had multiple levels of value. Again, they were able to provide more value, meaning they were able to increase contract value, and all without having to hire a large amount of extra engineers, which is not the case had it been an ETL, where you would be creating custom code often and having to maintain these pipelines. But you'll kind of see a similar pattern here as far as like extra engineers being hired, or the case of not needing to hire extra engineers. So let's go over to the next case. All right, next let's talk about MVF. So MVF similarly is a customer generation platform. So it helps you get more customers essentially. They ran into the common issue that I see everywhere as a consultant, which is you'll have very complex ETL type systems. It might not even technically be an ETL. Essentially what they had a combination of Excel, Google Sheets, Access, some database connected to all of this. Probably it was running on some sort of cron based system, and it gets really hairy really fast. This becomes a nightmare to maintain because you're having to do multiple steps where someone's manually copy pasting data from one data source to another, and then maybe running some sort of script, and you've got like a whole 3-page document on how just to run some complex process. And all in all, MVF, despite all this hard work, didn't really even have a single source of truth, which is typically, again, some sort of data warehouse. So this is why they turned to Fivetran to kind of simplify and unify their whole data loading process. And so they were able to take, again, all these data sources you see here, where it's like Amazon S3, Bing Ads, Google Ads, MySQL, and multiple other data sources, and bring them all together, and thus create some sort of centralized data warehousing system, rather than having this complex, again, array of Google Sheets and Excel and trying to, mishmash reports every, month or week. for your end users. In turn, what this led to was an increased bit of rescued revenue that ranged from about 300 to 700 pounds a month. They eliminated a lot of data pipeline maintenance costs. Again, like you could basically get rid of all that hairy mess they had before. You didn't have to recreate some sort of complex system in Airflow or some other form of framework. Instead, you could just turn to Fivetran, and all in all, this reduced overall engineering time. Producing ELTs is a very fast process in general because, again, you can kind of just pull what data you need to, and you don't have to do too much in terms of transform on the front end. Again, you still have to do the transform at some point. That you're not escaping that, and sometimes you'll still have to do some sort of modeling, but just getting the data in its raw state to your final data warehouse without having to write code is a big time saver. As someone who's written, Salesforce data connectors and Workday data pipelines over and over again, having pre-made code for that is very helpful. Because again, if you can get rid of this whole, honestly, 4 to 8 hour process for maybe 1 or 2 pipelines, you save a ton of time. All right, so for this final use case, we'll be going over Strava. Strava is an internet service for tracking human exercise, which incorporates social network features and a couple other things. So you can track, your workouts as well as other people's workouts that you might be interested in. Their goal, Strava, was to essentially understand their customer journey throughout their whole process of marketing. If a customer is seeing an ad, like what does it take to get them to purchase, et cetera, kind of getting that customer 360 view. But the problem being was their engineering team was too small to end up pulling all this extra data in from all these different data sources and then having to model it, et cetera. So similar to these other examples, they were able to switch to Fivetran and then pull in all these various data sources and gain brand new insights that they had never kind of gained before about their customer. This helped them better prioritize what features they were developing, as well as reduce the need to hire a full-time data engineer, saving somewhere in the range of, again, about $120K. And that's just, again, salary, not including taxes and benefits, as well as just creating more of a centralized data system. Again, this small difference between when the load and the transform are done can lead to big changes as far as how fast people can start getting insight. So these were just 3 use cases. I encourage you to go download the PDF. There's a ton of other examples, honestly, there. I really enjoyed it. It was honestly just a good piece of content in general. Fivetran really did a good job as far as putting together, clear and concise messaging for what actually worked as an ELT. Again, Fivetran is going to be biased towards themselves because they're their own product, but you can kind of see where the benefits lie. So now what? Is ELT for you? That's definitely the question as you leave this presentation. If you're looking for someone to give you some quick tips, feel free to follow up with our team. We have contact information below. We would love to help provide some guidance as far as products as well as development. Our team does end-to-end data solutions, so that means we'll create everything from, again, your ELT or ETL, data warehouse development to your data science algorithms, dashboards, and if you need to create some sort of data API, that's what our team essentially does. We help manage your whole data lifecycle without you needing to hire an entirely new data engineer. We use tools like Fivetran because it helps us do more with less. So we end up saving you time as well as helping you improve your bottom line without having to invest $200K into an entirely new engineering team. So thanks so much for listening. We hope this was helpful as far as showing what ELTs can do. Please pay attention for any future videos. We produce them as frequently as we can when we see interesting pieces of information. So thank you so much for listening today, and we'll see you later. Bye.